We are back, and we are so glad you're joining us on this Monday, September 9th. One of the issues that we touch base on all the time, because it is an issue that just keeps evolving and generally not in good ways, is immigration. Hugo Rojas of Scott D. Pollock and Associates, which is an immigration law firm here in Chicago. Hugo joins us, as he has before, to try to make sense of what is going on in the world. Hello, Hugo. How are you?
Hi, Joan.
How is your Monday so far?
Great. How was yours?
So far, so good.
All right.
We'll try not to beat you up too badly.
Yeah, I've got big shoes to fill. You had David Orr here before.
I know. He's such a great guy. He's just knows everybody knows where all the bodies are buried and is not afraid to talk about it. I love that about him.
Yeah.
Hey, the Sun Times did a big article on your case. Did you
Oh,
see it?
yeah, we talked about that the last time.
The Beverly woman who got her green card after almost getting deported. Talk to the listeners again about this.
Yeah, and in fact, she was originally granted permission to stay here on a program that, no, not surprisingly, the Trump administration wants to get rid of, which is
all of them, but
right.
Yeah.
Among the ones, she's a national of France. Her fiance at the time was touring the U.S. and got in a terrible car accident, and she was able to come here on a tourist visa to care for him.
It was a paraplegic error.
Yeah. It was a terrible accident. He became a paraplegic as a result. So she came on a tourist visa. That's the visa she had, and she just wanted to get here because her fiance was in a bad way, of course. She overstayed because her fiance was in the hospital for more than 6 months, and her
I
visa
don't
was only
imagine
good.
the date on her visa was uppermost in her mind.
Probably not.
When someone you love is teetering on the edge of death.
Probably not. And so she overstayed, of course, and she eventually was in the long term. Long story short, at least for the beginning of the story, she was granted permission to stay here to care for her fiance. So she was put in proceedings, and at the beginning, because she'd overstayed, but she was able to beat that case because of this humanitarian concern.
Okay.
So she was granted permission to stay here. Fast forward years later, she marries a U.S. citizen. So she's here all this time in 2007.
He passed away.
He passes away. She's still here. She eventually marries a U.S. citizen. U.S. citizen applies for her green. She applies for a green card because of the marriage with a U.S. citizen following the death of her former fiance. And in the process of applying for citizenship, USCIS, in their wisdom, decides, wait a minute, this person has a order of removal from how many, 12 years ago, 13 years prior, and they decide to put her in removal proceedings. And so she had all sorts of good facts to her case. I mean, she'd been here a long time. She had committed no crime. She was doing things the right way. She had permission to stay. She was granted permission to be here.
And they said she had to be out of the country by July 8th.
Right. And the only reason they knew about it is because she
tried to do the right thing.
She did what so many people always ask of folks who are here. Why don't they just follow the rules and do the paperwork? Well, she did. And they tried to remove her, and we got involved. We sued the government, and we won. And so now she has her green card.
Yes, it arrived in the mail. That's what the article in the Sun Times was about. It says, a French woman who's lived in the Beverly neighborhood for close to 30 years recently got her green card in the mail after almost being deported earlier this summer. It was Carlos Ballesteros who wrote about this for the Sun Times.
Yes, great victory.
Amazing.
So, I mean, good things still do happen. But the thing is, now you have to fight for everything. And victories can still happen, but it's the government is trying to make things harder.
And toward that end, there have been some new, what do we call them, regulations? Or when you try to get rid of a regulation, is that a new regulation? I'm so confused, Hugo.
Well, regulations imply that when the government institutes a regulation, it implies that there's a process that's gone through and public comment. This is not what you're referring to. Is not a regulation. It was just an edict. It's a new rule that rightly was challenged in court. But so
Explain what it
sure,
is.
sure. Back in July, the in response to the increase in asylum seekers on the southern border, the government, or the Trump administration specifically, uh, issued a new rule where it stated that if you are an asylum seeker in the U.S., you could no longer ask for asylum if you had the opportunity to ask for asylum in a third country that was safe, and meaning Mexico.
So if you're in Guatemala and you walk through Mexico and you come to the U.S. border and you say, I want asylum, they're like, oh, no,
No,
Mexico's fine,
you
looking good.
you could have asked in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's not what the law says at all. The law actually says if you're in the U.S. or if you present yourself at a port of entry, you have the right to apply for asylum in the U.S. Period. That's the law. So if the folks who are in the administration right now have a problem with that law, there's a process well described in the Constitution.
Change the law.
Change the law. Make your case and change the law. But that's not what this is. This was a rule change that was not open for public comment at all, and so they were sued. And in the Ninth Circuit, I believe they were sued, and the judge in the Ninth Circuit issued an injunction, basically saying you can't implement this rule until the merits of the case have been decided. And so, in response to that, the government, the Department of Justice, instead of going through the process of going up the regular judiciary process through district court and court of appeals and finally the Supreme Court to make a decision, they went directly to the Supreme Court and asked them to intervene on a fast track basis to nullify the injunction. And so they did that on August 23rd, I believe. And so we think a decision will be coming pretty soon on that.
So what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think it's hard. Who knows?
He's speechless. He literally cannot speak.
Well, I mean, who knows? I mean, I think at this point, it's pretty clear what the law says. The law says any alien who's physically present in the United States or who arrives in the United States, whether or not at a designated port of arrival, may apply for asylum. That's it. That's what the law says. So if you want to change that law, you have to persuade people. You have to follow. What's that Saturday morning? I'm just a bill. someone someone should just
so
alert people.
If you live in Greenland and you come through Canada and ask for asylum, they'd say, nope, you got to stay in Canada.
Right, exactly. So, it seems to. I agree with the lawyer from the ACLU who said, I mean, this is a tectonic shift. It's completely beyond the confines of what the statute says. So if the Supreme Court was doing its job, they would have to agree with that. Although the Supreme Court could decide that they could forego deciding on the merits of the lawsuit and simply say that enforcement of the rule could proceed while the merits are being decided.
Oh,
so that'd be a way of punting, basically.
Yeah. So, but if they said something like that, so basically what they would be doing is undoing the injunction.
Correct.
Saying, no, we're not going to hold this in abeyance. We're not going to stop this from taking effect. While we're figuring it out, it should probably go through. And then does that mean if they made a ruling like that means they're accepting the case, or are they kicking it back so that it climbs the judicial tree the way it probably should have in the first place?
It could mean that. It could mean that they could tailor their decision only to deal with the injunctive relief.
So that would be kind of a procedural answer to this request. Whereas if they say, yes, this is a case we will take, that means that they're definitely going to make a ruling.
It could, yeah, on the merits potentially. But if I had to guess, I would think that they would make the more procedural decision and then have the merits decided on the lower courts and then have that work its way up. But the effect will be, the effect will be basically the implementation of this rule for the time being.
Mm-hmm. If they do a procedural decision like that, do they still have to vote as a body, or is that something the Chief Justice can say, nah, we're not going to hear that. We're going to just kick it back, and this is what I say?
Right. Well, they can, if they decide not to take it up, that's a decision in and of itself. And for instance, they could decide not to take the appeal, this emergency appeal, and then things would stay as they are. Basically, there's an injunction in place. It's in San Francisco, and they can work through the Court of Appeals that way. If they decide to make a ruling on the injunction itself, then that would be 9 justices, and it'd probably end up 5-4.
Well, we do have one potential swing. I mean, John Roberts doesn't always, I think it's John Roberts, isn't it?
Yeah,
doesn't always vote the way you think he's going to vote. He whiffles and he waffles, and he chooses which team he's going to be a part of.
Yeah.
But if Donald, one of the things, aside from how you feel about healthcare, and frankly, even how you feel about immigration, if Donald Trump is reelected, he's going to probably have at least 2 more seats to appoint. Or rather, Mitch McConnell will, or rather, no, the Federalist Society will, since nobody really bothers to vet anybody in this administration. They just go to the conservative group whose support they want and say, hey, you got a judge for me? That's how we got Neil Gorsuch. That's how we got Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah, it's potentially they potentially could have as many as 2 or 3 more. Yeah.
And then your life is really going to get very complicated.
It's already interesting.
Yeah.
So.
Have you, with all this craziness that's been going on with immigration, have you and your firm seen a real uptick in the number of clients coming through the door?
Absolutely. I think that the immigration law has always been complex. It's highly regulated, of course. It's never been easy to immigrate legally to the U.S., notwithstanding what you hear the president says, that we've never had open borders. Mm-hmm. It's always, save for the late 1800s, it's always been it's been a complex process. What's happened now is that there's a level of anxiety out there about procedures that used to be somewhat routine. Non-immigrant visas, temporary visas, that are clearly approvable are getting denied, are getting extra scrutiny, unjustifiably so. And so the costs of getting approvals and the costs of being in the legal immigration system are actually going up. And so it's what's happening is what's being created is what some people are calling an invisible wall. So all sorts of new rules, all sorts of extra scrutiny, increased requests for evidence that's already been submitted. It just makes things more costly, makes things take longer. If I were cynical, I would say that with the aim of having people hopefully give up and go back.
I talked to an immigration attorney about a month ago, and she said that, especially on Mondays, but she wakes up in the morning and she's like, what do you suppose the law is going to be today? What new rule changes are coming today? Right. And, it's like, you guys have to be nimble.
Yeah. Just the other day, I received a letter from USCIS asking for evidence that my client had a architecture degree from the University of Kansas. The case was about a dentist from Minnesota. You still have to respond to that. You still have to show evidence that's already in the record. So they're disorganized on that end, but I think it's kind of an organized chaos to make things more difficult for everyone.
Did you get the wrong letter?
I got yeah. It was just it was. I mean, that I just mentioned that because just to mention that
It's
it's the level of disorganization and chaos is absurd. Um, but it's hard given the context of how adjudications are going. It's hard to come to any other conclusion that it's part and parcel of a strategy to make things more difficult.
Hugo, it seems like every time you're here, I'm saying the same thing. Rule changes, moves to make immigration tougher, court challenges. It's like the words stay the same, but the stories change. Tell me what's going on with. I'm sorry, we were just talking about it during break, and now I've had a brain
Oh,
blank.
talking about the
There you go.
public charge.
There you
Yes.
go. Thank you, Hugo.
Yeah.
Mine
So
is a terrible thing to waste.
right. Well, it's coming up. There's been a rule change, it's making it again more difficult for people to immigrate legally. People who want to actually do the right thing
and put their names in the system and
mm,
fill out the paperwork and
absolutely right. There's starting next month there will be an additional barrier for folks who want to take advantage of the legal immigration system, which basically says if you've ever used public benefits or if you're likely to use public benefits. That's the key. If you're likely to use,
how does anybody know if they're likely to use
there's
public
a good,
benefits?
that's how it's going to be implemented
What the heck?
is the big issue.
I could be likely to use public benefits. I mean, what's the yardstick there?
There's a series of factors, and some factors weigh heavily against being approved for a green card, and some factors weigh favorably. So if you are coming here and you're sponsored by a U.S. company, so you're going to be employed at a certain wage, and that's a very positive factor. If you're a senior citizen and you have a U.S. citizen son or daughter who's sponsoring you, so you can be together as a family, and you're retired, so you don't have any prospect of future work, that's a very negative factor potentially.
Really? Even though you have family who, at least theoretically, would
Again,
provide you with food and shelter?
just based on what's been released so far, that seems to be the case. How that's going to be implemented is a big concern. We really don't know how it's going to be implemented, but that's a big concern. I mean, so among the people who could be negatively impacted could be immigrants who are seniors, for instance.
So the family is living in the United States and they want to bring over one of
Mom
their
or dad.
great aunts or a grandparent or an elderly parent, and that is going to be not. What if the family says, "Look, we have an in-law apartment.
Right.
They're not going to need any assistance with housing. We have a two-income family. We will put food on their table.
Right,
We will
right.
pay for their medical care."
For instance, just to clarify something, the only in the scenario I'm talking about, the only people who would be eligible to immigrate would be the parents of, say, a U.S. citizen petitioner. So it wouldn't be an aunt. So
Oh,
just to make
you
it
got to
clear,
be first degree relative.
right, exactly. This whole notion of chain migration that's out
Yes,
there is a red herring.
first we'll get
right?
mom and dad, and then we'll get grandma and grandpa, and then we'll bring
Oh,
all
well,
the aunts and uncles.
yeah, right. So no, I mean, the U.S. citizens can petition for their parents, and they're classified as immediate relatives. In any event, there's a contradiction in the rules because yes, there as part of the immigration system, if you're sponsoring someone, you have to tell the government that you're going to be responsible for them for 10 years or until they become citizens themselves, that they won't take up any public benefits. But this new rule kind of contradicts that. So we don't really know how those two things are going to interact.
Well, who's going to make that determination?
Well, and then I think it's going to come to the point where there might be, again, talking about a lawsuit, we're talking about a dispute that someone's going to have to resolve.
So when a new rule change or a new suggested policy like this comes down, Does that mean that every different Customs and Border Patrol outpost everywhere is going to interpret it in their own way? And, I mean, somebody in Chicago could say, well, that we want this proof. And somebody in Kansas could say, oh, well, we'll just keep doing things the way we always
Right.
have.
It shouldn't be that way, but I mean, officers have a lot of discretion when it comes to this sort of decision making. Um, it's, I wish I could have a clear answer, but it's really a discretionary based system. It shouldn't be that way. In practice, it kind of is that way.
How many Customs and Border Patrol and ICE agents would you estimate that there are working in the Chicagoland area? Is it a big bureaucracy?
Yes, and the U. Well, we who do, let's break that apart. So, Department of Homeland Security, there's three main divisions of it. So you've got USCIS.
Mm-hmm.
USCIS are the ones who take your paper applications. So if you're applying for a green card, if you're applying for naturalization, if you're applying for a temporary visa while you're in the U.S. or change of status of
Mm-hmm.
some sort, you mail those things to USCIS. The people you find at the airport, you come off the airplane,
Mm-hmm.
you've got an international flight, you have a passport to let you in. The officer you interact with, those people belong also to the Department of Homeland Security, but their division is called CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol Agency. And then the sort of third leg of that stool would be interior enforcement. So when you hear about these raids at
Mm-hmm.
these poultry plants in Mississippi and things
Yes,
like that, those would be interior customs enforcement. So that would be
that's
ICE.
ICE.
So in Chicagoland has several dozen agents in each one of those divisions in Chicago. And so multiply that throughout cities and towns across America. It's a very big bureaucracy.
You've been doing this work a while. I would imagine you know some of these people now that you see the same faces, or do you just see the lawyers
Yes.
that
No,
representing
no.
them?
Yeah, I've interacted with agents and officers at all three of these agencies, and by and large, I would say that particularly the ICE agents that I've interacted with, they'll say that changes come from the top, and they just have to comply. And so, a lot of times, you have true believers, and they're just and they love these changes because they feel like they're protecting America.
Mm.
But there are folks who may feel uncomfortable with how the direction things are going, and but kind of see their hands as tied.
So it
It runs a
it's
gamut.
easy to demonize these people.
These folks. A lot of them are doing the best job that they can, for sure. I believe that.
If you had to make an estimate of what percentage of these bureaucracies in our area are the true believers, I mean, is it scary? Is it like 50%?
That's not been my experience. You have some people who are more zealous than others, but my experience is that most people want to try to do the best job that they can, for sure.
And my experience, having worked at a lot of different places over a very patchwork career, is there are jerks everywhere. I mean, I've worked in hospitals, I've taught, I've done television, I've done radio, I've done all kinds of things, and you know what? Most people, I think, just really want to do their job and get along, but you know,
It's in this environment. It's really hard to be divorced from the real life consequences of their actions, for sure.
well, and just talking about it coming down from the top, there is a word today that the Secretary of Commerce threatened, the National Oceanic and
Mm.
Atmospheric Administration, who sent out the edict that said,
Yeah.
"Don't ever contradict the president. If you really feel like he's wrong, just keep your mouth shut." Apparently, the Commerce Secretary told NOAA that if they didn't fall in line, there were going to be firings. He was going to make sure that there were firings. So, I mean, it's just terrifying, and it's such a difficult situation for even people of good conscience, to try to do what's right. I mean, I
Yeah.
feel really sorry for that one National Weather Service forecaster who immediately tweeted, "No, don't worry, Alabama. No, no, no
Yeah.
worries. There's Dorian isn't coming there. That's not going to happen. You are not in the cone of uncertainty." I mean, have we heard from that person? Have they disappeared?
Yeah.
I mean, it's terrifying, but it
Right.
it almost feels Orwellian
Yeah.
these days.
I will say, the way it plays out in our cases is, you do run into people who, uh, times past would have used their discretion. And for example, this the one we were talking about at the beginning of the broadcast,
Corinna?
yeah, Karina Tersinovich, is that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
i- i- in years past, if someone like that was detained, you would be able to talk to the ICE officer who detained her, and you probably be able to have her released without a bail on her own recognizance. Those kinds of that kind of discretion is less and less, um, because there is a command that everything's going to be enforced and no one gets released.
Do you see anything changing in the next year and a half?
We have an election,
Yeah. And let's just not even worry about what happens after the election.
right?
But do you think this is going to get worse before it gets better? Because
Well,
that's been my prediction. I think that especially since even Trump's own pollsters are telling him that the election looks really bad for him, I think he's going to get crazier. I don't see how that's possible, but I think that the things he starts doing are going to be, I think he's going to be more erratic.
that very well may be, but I think the what the case with Mr. Sunovich indicates, and everything we've talked about in terms of the the rules that are trying to be implemented, you're just going to have to fight them. We're just going to have to keep fighting them in every turn, and sometimes you win, and sometimes you won't. But the thing that's for certain is that every moment we have to be ready to keep fighting.
Well, thank you, Hugo. You're fighting the good fight here, and I wish you well. Hugo Rojas is an immigration attorney with Scott D. Pollock and Associates, and we tap him quite regularly to explain the newest permutations of immigration law and rule changes and policy changes and enforcement changes and all the changes that are going down. And now we have to keep an eye and see what the Supreme Court says about this injunction that is
Correct.
trying to keep this new crazy asylum rule at bay for people. Okay, we'll keep an eye on it. And if anything new develops, make sure you let us know in case it slips through our fingers.
Will do. Thank you.